There's a notion in the world now, I call it infrastructure competitiveness. Developing countries are trying to outdo themselves. In the US, their road and interstate system is crumbling. All of you have seen pictures of highways that fall apart in the US. They haven't done much to their infrastructure over the last 20, 30, or 40 years or so. It's another growth area for us and will become even more important when a Zuma-style administration perhaps takes office next year. You must remember, infrastructure is a great winner for a left-of-center government. Left-of-center people in trade unions and Communist Party, in more sort of pragmatic socialists, love to spend money on infrastructure. Now, you can spend too much money and get yourself into national debt, or you can spend the right quantities to make us much more competitive. And I think we are well on the way to that. And if you have a look at the figures coming out of state spend, in particular on infrastructure, you'll see the dramatic increase. We are now spending nearly 500 billion rand on infrastructure over the next few years. You can see the figure there. That really is effectively infrastructure spend. You can just see it growing dramatically over the last few years. And this, although spurred on by World Cup 2010, is really a much longer, much more solid foundation that's being created for South Africa running forward. I get quite excited about that as well. Now, let me turn to soap operas. I won't ask any of you in this room how many of you watch soap operas on a regular basis. I don't want to embarrass anybody. You know, no one will admit to watching Bold and the Beautiful or Izzy Dingo on a regular basis. It's a little bit like asking an audience how many of you, voted for the National Party prior to 1994, or in fact, if you go to Russia, no one will admit to voting for the Communist Party or being a member of the Communist Party. So I won't ask you that question. But I want to turn from the economy to the political scene. And I've always regarded South Africa's politics as something of a soap opera. And, not that I watch soap operas, of course. I happen to look at Soap Opera Digest magazines. These are the magazines that come out in the United States, which give you all the background and the lowdown and the gossip on what's been happening with the soap opera stars. And all of us love now in the world to read what stars are doing. But look at these soap opera magazines and look to see some of the titles of the articles that are on these magazines. Isn't it fascinating that one of the titles there, one of the articles in the magazine, "There's no room for me"? Well, that sounds a little bit like President Mbeki at Polokwane. There certainly was no room for President Mbeki at Polokwane. Shocking splits, it says on this other weekly magazine. Well, we may well see some shocking splits coming up within the ruling party. When characters change overnight, it doesn't just happen on television, it happens at the ANC Polokwane conference and 3 weeks ago here in South Africa with Motlanti's presidency. The young and the restless. Well, the ANC Youth League maybe could be termed the young and the restless. I mean, it goes on and on. Who's coming and who's going? Well, we all know who's coming, and Mr. Shaloa's gone. There's a new premier here. I mean, it's all part and parcel of the great soap opera of South Africa's political life. And I'm often asked, and I was asked to comment, I do a lot of radio work, and I was asked to comment a few weeks ago, do I think that there's a crisis in South Africa? And my answer was no, there isn't a crisis in South Africa, but there is high political drama. And we are living through an era of high political drama. But let's look at some other countries of the world, because I like to look at what's happening elsewhere as well. We mustn't just focus in on ourselves all the time. Look to see what happened elsewhere in the world when political leaders either overstayed their welcome or were removed from office. And one of the great and most successful British recent political leaders, Margaret Thatcher, was unceremoniously booted out of her position after a long period of time. Clearly, the British had a little bit enough of Thatcherism, but nevertheless, the way in which Margaret Thatcher was handled by her own political party, today she resents the way she was handled to a great degree. Well, reminiscent, in a sense, to the way Thabo Mbeki was handled. It doesn't just happen here, it happens, of course, in the UK as well. The picture at the bottom of the screen is the Italian Parliament. And I love looking at Italy, because Italy goes through a new government just about every year or every 18 months. That's the Italian political culture. Italy, a major nation, one of the G8 nations of the world, a wealthy, powerful, rich nation, and they live with a very high degree of internal political instability and changes of personality at the top. I could go on. In Thailand, only a few weeks ago, and you've seen it on the news in the last 24 hours, Thailand has had yet another military coup. Thailand, one of the Asian tiger economies, one of the great emerging giants of this world, and yet, from a political point of view, highly unstable. And there were riots in the streets of Bangkok last night. It happens, and yet life goes on. In Israel, another example I always like to look at, they have almost as many changes of government in Israel as they do in Italy, for that matter. And in the last few weeks, the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Olmert, has found himself embroiled in a financial scandal, and the poor man there holding his head, he had to resign from office. Well, it's an advanced democracy, and yet look at the scandal and look at the political strife there. And finally, the Japanese, by the way, Japanese, stable, wonderful country. They've had 4 prime ministers elected in the last 2 years because they've resigned through scandal or through political infighting in their ruling parties. So for goodness sake, everybody, what's the big deal about the drama that we've had over the last while? When you look at these stable, advanced and mature democracies, more or less, Thailand perhaps, not quite sure how mature it is when you have military coups, but in the most part, they've institutionalized and got used to the way in which political competition plays itself out at the top levels of governance in their countries. Now, we're not used to that in South Africa. We've always been used to long, extended periods of rule by one leader or one political party. We moan about it, but we're used to it. And now what we are seeing here is an attack on that. And that attack, which other countries live with, and in fact benefits a country by creating a new degree of political competition in that society, we now say, well, this is a crisis and it doesn't look good and what's going to happen in the future? It's a healthy part of a maturing democracy indeed.